Hey, what's going on, everyone? This is Eric with SweetSpotDFS, and in this video, I'm going to answer the question, does projected ownership matter? And I'm going to do that by showing you the DraftKings data that I've collected from the entire 2021 season. I've compiled it all into a spreadsheet for us to analyze. And if you want access to that spreadsheet, I will leave a link in the description below. That link is going to send you to a Google Doc where you can either follow along with me through this video, or you can make a copy of it for your own personal use. That way you can keep it for as long as you would like. There is one distinction to make though. This is post lineup lock data, which means they're not projections. Projections come prior to lineup lock. But if there's a case that I'm going to make, usually projected stats are very, very close to the ownership stats. And that is exactly what the people and websites who advertise those stats say. So in my opinion, I think we can compare them fairly equally. If you disagree, go ahead, sound off in the comment section below. Now, what is the purpose of projected ownership? Well, for some, it's to gain leverage on other DFS players. The idea is that pivoting from a high-owned golfer to a low-owned golfer in the same salary tier will give you, or at least it will provide you, a better chance of winning money or winning more money, possibly taking down a GPP. Now, other people also believe that a 10% owned golfer, you would gain 90% leverage on everyone else. When you just think about numbers as a whole, I wouldn't disagree with that logic whatsoever. But I have a hard time agreeing with just pivoting from one player to another because of ownership. You have to understand the skill levels of those players and make a proper pivot in that scenario. But you don't have to take my opinion for it. Let's let the data speak to that. So let's go ahead. Let's get into the spreadsheet. Again, available to you guys to use with the link in the description below. The first page I want to show you, the first tab in the spreadsheet, is called Contests. This is where I pulled the data from. So you can see the contest name and the entry fee that I spent to be in that contest. One thing you'll note, I don't really play for a lot of money. A lot of $3 and $5 contests in here, some $1, even some 10-cent games, so on and so forth. You will see some milli makers and stuff like that. It's important to note that because the ownership from these contests are going to be slightly watered down than your $15, your $33, your $44 contests, or anything north of that. When you get north of those entry fees, you're going to find that the ownership becomes more polarizing, where maybe a 30% John Rahm at the US Open might be 35-40% in those higher entry fee games. So just keep that in mind. If you're a high stakes player, just understand that. And if you're a high stakes player, you're probably not watching this video, if I'm being honest. The next tab is called the Master tab. This is the engine of this entire spreadsheet. There are a lot of formulas that pull from this sheet. So if you do make a copy that you can manipulate your own, be aware that anything that you do will affect the rest of the spreadsheet, all the other fields and formulas that I have in place. For some of you guys out there, the data that I grabbed from DraftKings would be obviously the player name, the salaries, the ownership number, and the DK points. Now, I grabbed the result from the PGA Tour website. If you see discrepancies with any of these pieces of data, let me know. I'm pretty sure they are exactly 100% correct. The rest of the fields that I have included are kind of my own personal data points. Now, the optimal lineup should be self-explanatory. It's the highest points. It's 6 golfers with the highest point total under $50,000. That's what your optimal lineup is. Again, if you see discrepancy with any of these contests, please let me know. But again, I'm pretty sure they're all perfect. This SS optimal is what I call the sweet spot optimal, and there are conditions behind this. The first one, all 6 players have to be over $49,000 or $49,000 and above. All 6 players need to finish inside the top 10 as well, because during my whole process, I'm only looking at top 10 results. So that just applies to this perfectly. And it has to beat the GPP winning lineup. So again, there are 51 events. I didn't even mention that. 2021 is your super season. There's 51 events. I believe we had 47 scenarios where there was an SS optimal. The other like 4 tournaments, you couldn't find 6 golfers that would have beaten the GPP winning lineup that were over $49,000. Or I shouldn't even say it that way. There were 6 golfers that you couldn't find inside the top 10 to reach $49,000. That's usually what ended up happening. So out of those 47 where there was an SS optimal, only one of those did not beat the GPP winning lineup. I shouldn't even say that. One of the other 4, I should say. That's how it goes. I'm sorry. I don't want to confuse you guys. So there were 46 or 47 instances or tournaments where there was an SS optimal. The other 4 or 5, one of those was due to the GPP winning lineup being the optimal lineup. So that tells you 46 tournaments, there was an SS optimal and it beat the GPP winning lineup. So just keep that in mind. Hopefully I didn't confuse you. If I did, please leave questions in the comment section below. And then the rest of these are just helpful for me to pull data from. So I basically looked at all the ownerships. I mean, most of these probably, they once had formulas in them, but I removed them because it just bogs down the spreadsheet if you have too many formulas in there. But you can go ahead and validate this information as well. So like, if we just look at the Safeway Open, just want to show you guys this before I dive into the spreadsheet. So we're just looking at the Safeway. If I take your highest ownership levels, as you can see, these are your top 10 right here. They are in that top 10 own. And top 3 per tier is looking at their salary. You can disregard that. But yeah, top 10. Okay, I'm not going to get further into this, but hopefully you understand. When it comes to like top 3 per tier, if I go yes to all these, actually, let me sort by salary, and then we go here. You're going to see that it goes by salary. So these are your top 3 owned 10K golfers, your top 3 9K golfers, your top 3 owned 8K, 7K, 6K, so on and so forth. So that's how that one looks. And we'll talk about this a little bit later. I don't want to bore you down right now with all of that information. Let's just sort that one back and get back to what we're getting at. Here is where we're going to talk the most through, the summary page. So if you did download this, or if you're just watching it with me and you want to follow along with, this is where you're going to find all the summaries that I'm going to be talking about. This little summary is just looking at the ownership number. And then I've got a bunch of summaries down here. Overall stats for top 10 owned golfers in each tournament. Ownership by salary tiers. This is your top 3 per tier. So 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. Then we have the top owned, the lowest owned, and the middle owned. Now, one thing to note, your middle owned per tournament is excluding the lowest owned per tournament and the top 3 per tier owned per tournament. I know that might sound a little weird or a little whatever, but I'll explain it as we go through. So the first one to talk about is your actual ownership numbers. Now, if you're just looking at numbers, just to look at numbers, here you go. This is your most general summary you can possibly get. And it's just based off ownership number. As you can see, when you look at a higher ownership, you're going to see a better result. 30 to 35%, your average finishing position is 22.63. And as you go down, it gets worse. So it's kind of just shows you just based off average result, it's not as good. Now there's a caveat to all this. I'm sure some of you stat guys already saw this. Your numbers also increase as you go down. Because when you include the 6K range, the 7K range, where the ownership isn't that high, you're going to lump those numbers down here. And that's why I kind of included this 0 to 1%. Because this is where you're going to find most of your just not used 6K golfers. Any notable golfer is going to come from these ranges on up, 1 to 5 and up. There is one category where the number actually gets better the further down you get, and that's total wins. To me, that just becomes a volume-driven number. So the fact that we have more golfers in this ownership range provides better chances of winning the tournament. And plus your 10 to 15% owned guys, those are your high quality 7K, 8K golfers that can easily win this tournament. So yeah, in the case of projected ownerships and just the ownership number as a raw number, you get more wins the less owned that they are. But for the rest of the stats, like top 10%, cut made percentage, missed cut percentage, all of your stats get better the further up you go in ownership. And same thing applies with average DK points, DK position, DK top 10%. Optimal lineup percentage is also better. Same with sweet spot optimal. And then look at GPP. Most of your GPP winners are using high owned golfers. And that's not to say all 6 of your golfers need to be high owned. It just means some of your golfers need to be owned. I almost forgot to mention this earlier on. I'll mention it now. There's a longer version of this video that my friend Nik Lazar and I did going over this in depth. So if you want to check that out, there's a link in the description below. I'm sorry for not saying that earlier, Nick. My apologies. But yes, he and I went through this, and maybe you know him, maybe you don't. He's Mr. Guru Nick on Twitter. He also writes for Fantasy Golf Insider. So just keep that in mind. But I'm going to move on from just looking at the summaries and come down to kind of little, like, to me, I really like comparing these summaries down here. So you can see top owned golfer per salary tier and lowest owned golfer. So if you were just to make the assessment, or just you yourself, when you create lineups, you're like, I'm just going to grab the lowest owned golfer in each tier, or at least in one of the tiers. Here's how that breakdown works. You can see the average result much better for your 10K golfers that are top owned than your low owned golfers. And that's actually going to apply for all of the ranges. There is one range that's really close. That's the 9K range. But the rest of them, the 9 and 7K, I didn't even see that. 7K is almost identical. So your 9 and 7K ranges, pretty darn close when it comes to their average result. But as we scroll over a little bit more, you get more wins out of your top owned guys than you do down here, except for the 9K. Top 10 frequency rate, that is how frequently in a tournament does a golfer who is, a top owned or a low owned golfer finish inside the top 10. Your frequency numbers are higher. Your top 10 percentages are higher. The higher owned golfer you get, again, that 9K range, a little pesky. But here you go. Your 9K range in the top owned, much better at making cuts than your low owned. And you can see that with missed cuts. You can see that with your DK average, points, just every stat. I don't have to keep telling you this. You guys can see it on the screen. And if you're following along, you're going to see the same thing. And again, these are numbers that have formulas that are driven from the master sheet. So this isn't me just pulling this information. Like you guys can validate me on this stuff. So it's just showing you guys, it wouldn't make sense, obviously, to pivot from a top owned guy to a low owned guy just because. Like, you need to have a good reason if you're going to do that. So right away, I can tell you, just looking at these two stat categories or these two summaries, it doesn't make any sense to pivot from a high owned golfer to a low owned golfer. Now, this is where probably the better meat, or whatever you want to call, to actually look at would be comparing your top 3 per tier versus your middle owned per tier. Because again, these numbers are not going to include these numbers. They're also not going to include the low owned. So in case there were bad stats in low owned, we're going to remove that and just look at these two. Now you're going to see it's pretty close. When you look at a lot of these ranges, they're very close, but it still favors your top owned golfers per tier. So your average result is better when you're looking at your top 3. Now the win rate is a little bit different, but again, you got to see the total amount of golfers in each of these tiers goes up when you're looking at middle owned. One thing to note, here's a reason why. Your 10K range has 4 to 6 golfers in it normally on any given tournament. Your 9K range has somewhere between 8 to 10 golfers in it normally. Your 8K range has somewhere between 10 to 15 golfers in it. Your 7K range has somewhere between 30 to 40. And then your 6K range has anything north of 70. So you're going to have way more numbers, the lower salaries you get. And if I'm also going to mention something, just to be transparent with you guys, top 3 per tier, if we only have 4 to 6 10K golfers, I'm grabbing the top half of the 10K range, which may or may not be fair to do. So if you guys don't like that, what I would suggest is, since I hid these, take the top owned per tier, whatever the numbers are here, you're probably going to have it, it's going to be better with raw stats. Just remove this number here, the top owned, or I should say this, yeah. Either way, you're going to subtract these two numbers. So 22 minus 11. The remaining, you just bring 11, you add it to the middle owned tier. Hopefully that wasn't confusing. So let me try to explain a little bit better. So because in the 10K range, we usually have 4 to 6. If we're only looking at the top 3, that's, you know, the majority owned in the top. So if we want to extract your top owned golfer from that 10K range, you'd extract the 11 from this number, and then the remaining that you would then move down to the middle owned. So that way we're only grabbing the top one from the 10K range. Hopefully you're able to understand that. If not, again, leave questions in the comment section. I am glad to answer them. But anyways, as we compare these stats, you can see the frequency rates. Well, they get a little bit different because, again, we're looking at a large number of 7K golfers when you come down here. But 8K and above is where I would probably look at. And you can see it pretty much balances out. Your top owned 10K golfer is really the only one that outperforms the middle owned. And again, I think that has to do a lot with just the volume of golfers in those tiers. But if you wanted to go a little bit further, you can see the top 10 success rate, the top 10% success rate. You can see the high owned outperforms the middle owned. Same goes with cut made, missed cut, and all the other stats as you go across. So again, it doesn't make sense to pivot from high owned to low owned or to middle owned for no reason, like not just for the number itself. Now, we can go a little bit deeper into this. I just want to make sure I'm not missing anything. Yeah, your GPP winning lineups, look at how many golfers are from the top 3, you know, owned golfers per tier versus the middle owned. It's just night and day. And these are guys who are winning money. So you can put a dollar amount behind this of how much money you'd be making just by looking at the top owned guys. So one other piece that we can look at, so I do have this summary here, but I think it's probably more beneficial to look at the top 10 matrix tab that I have here. And that's, again, looking at the top 10 highest owned golfers in each tournament and putting them through all these stats, or just creating all these columns and seeing how they perform. So you can see all the tournaments I have over here, whether or not they're a cut or a no cut, their average result, basically all the stats we were just looking at the previous page. What I'm going to show you guys is I'm going to come down to this summary portion of the report and just show you kind of some of the interesting stats. So out of 49 possible events, like I don't have data for the Barracuda, and then I ended up not having data for the Corrales Punta Cana, the 2020 version. So I have 49 total events. Of those 49, of your top 10 owned golfers in each of those events, 11 wins come from there. That's 22%, which is okay. It's not super great. I think Nick and I talked about this in our hour-long version. Not super great. But then you look at like top 10s, cut made 74%. That's pretty good. That means you're not really risking much for, you know, taking a high owned golfer. One of the more really interesting facts is when you go frequencies 2 or more down to 5 or more, that cut made percentage, or just cuts made, is large. There were 40 cut events in 2021. Golf of the top 10 highest owned, the frequency that 5 or more made the cut is almost 100%. So take that into account. Frequency is looking at each tournament individually and making, you know, counting the numbers of how many made the cut versus missed the cut. And then if we want to look at some of the other stats over here, you can see DK top 10s, optimal lineups, sweet spot optimals, GPPs. Like finding at least one in each of those categories is over 80%, which is really good. And then you can see the frequency of 2 or more is still pretty good in most of those categories. And then it kind of just falls off a little after that. So as I look at this, how I see it, you want always at least 2 of your golfers, I shouldn't say always, but most of the time you want 2 of your golfers in the highest owned per tournament dedicated in your lineup. Like if we're just using stats to use stats, you're going to have more success doing that. Especially you wouldn't really want to fade. I mean, there was one tournament where there wasn't a DK top 10 from the highest owned golfers. So, I mean, it just goes to show again, just pivoting off the high owned isn't always the way to go. Now, there are instances where you're going to want to, obviously. I'm one that chases the optimal lineup a lot. I also chase the SS optimal. This gives me enough, caution to not own, maybe do pivot from some of these guys, the top 10 highest. But I will say this too, your top 10 highest are going to include a lot of your golfers in the 10 and the 9K range. You're not going to be able to create lineups with all of them. You're just going to have to create the correct lineup. And I mean, that just goes with everything, right? But just know this is mostly 10, 9K golfers in each of the tournaments. So that's where we all gravitate towards when we build our lineups. We start usually salary up high and move on down. So going back to that summary page, when we look at this, we were only really just looking at the overall top 10 numbers, but we can also look at it per salary. And you can see your average finishing results really good. Your win success rate is okay. I mean, the amount of wins you get, 7, that's pretty good. The frequency that you're going to have a top 10 golfer inside the top 10 or top 10 owned golfer inside the top 10, pretty high. Same just goes with overall top 10 percentage. Cut made percentage is super good. Miscut percentage is really good as well. And then you can see the rest of the stats. So, I mean, here's what I'm going to conclude with. We're done looking at the spreadsheet. We're going to end this video. But before we do, to me, it never made sense to look at ownership to begin with. Just looking at it for leverage standpoint, I mean, I'm never going to argue against someone who just says a 10% owned whatever is going to have more leverage than 30% owned. Just by numbers alone, you're absolutely correct. But you should have a reason as to why that's a 30% owned golfer versus a 10% owned golfer. And if it's just like the reasoning doesn't make sense, then that's a perfect time to pivot to your 10K golfer or your 10% golfer, especially if your 10% golfer is one of your more favorite plays. So outside of that, though, I wouldn't say this. Like, I would never advocate to say, make sure all of the high owned golfers are in your lineup. I just think you should disregard ownership. Disregard the most common stats that would put most of the public on certain golfers. Understand which are the right plays and which are the wrong plays. At least try to do it the best you can. I know golf is volatile. I totally understand that. But there are people say this all the time. There's good chalk and there's bad chalk. Now, you should know what the bad chalk is. If there's a 20% Denny McCarthy week, you should probably avoid that. Or even like a 20% Patton Kizzire week, you should probably avoid that. But if there's a 30% John Rahm week or a 30% Justin Thomas week, maybe we don't avoid those. You just go with it. Either way, if you watch any of my videos, you know I don't look at the ownership. We just go straight by the buckets. We go straight by what makes sense to build our lineups around. And a lot of it doesn't even revolve around ownership. We're playing golfers who miss cuts. We're playing golfers with bad recent form, whereas most of the public are just gravitating towards good recent form, good course history, that kind of stuff, and building 6 golfers with the best of those stats, which probably isn't the right way to do. So that's all I have when it comes to projected ownership. Hopefully I answered that question for you guys. To me, I did. I mean, I don't think it matters. Projected ownership does not matter, but do whatever you guys want. Whatever you feel is right, that's what you should do. And if this actually gives you more ammo to look at projected ownership, I want to know. Leave a comment or email me at sweetspotdfs@gmail.com. I want to know. Maybe I'm missing something. But I'm going to end it there, guys. I appreciate it. Thank you guys for watching. Please leave a like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff, and I'll see you in the next one. All right, bye-bye.